For about half a century now, we've been seeing RPG adventure supplements published kind of like this. You start at point A, some stuff has to happen, then you get to point B. More triggers are required, then players have to go to point C. This may have worked for years, but nowadays it's just a complete drag for players and GMs. A recent example of this is when I tried to review one of the adventures published for Warhammer Age of Sigmar by Cubicle 7. That publisher makes some really great looking books and their presentation is very professional, but the actual adventure, at least in this instance, was a complete railroad. Events have to happen before players go to the next place. In more recent years, there's been a different approach to adventure presentation entering the mainstream. Almost all games by Free League, for example, embrace the idea of an adventure site, where instead of having plot-dependent scripted events waiting to be triggered, there are just areas where players explore at will in order to uncover clues or drama or important NPCs or items. In this video, I want to take apart one adventure site from Free League's gritty fantasy RPG Forbidden Lands and discuss the pros and cons of the approach in general, and then go over some ways to get the most out of your adventure site at your table. And then as a little bonus at the end, we will talk to Per Holmstrom, a veteran adventure site author for Forbidden Lands, both officially and unofficially, and I'll share with you what he told me are the most important points when you want to write your own adventure site. In Forbidden Lands, there are 3 sort of example adventure sites at the end of the Game Master's Guide, and then in the campaign books, there are 12 in Raven's Purge, 10 in Bitter Reach, and 8 in the Bloodmarch. And the ones in those campaign books all serve to present an overarching plot, but only in the loosest of ways. Players can visit these sites in any order except for the final adventure site, which presents a sort of finale for the whole campaign. Let's start by visiting our example adventure site in Forbidden Lands, a town called Grindbone. Just for context, this is in a realm that was once covered in a deadly mist that prevented most people from being able to freely travel at night. Not only is there no kingdom or monarchy or any semblance of governance in the realm, the only people who were able to travel freely from town to town were religious fanatics who worshipped an evil sorcerer. So not a very bright or happy setting. Anyway, the creators of the game present this adventure site, which is the first one in the campaign book Raven's Purge, in terms of several distinct elements. And this is at the core of the whole concept of the adventure site. With each site, you will see the background, getting here, legends, location descriptions, monsters and NPCs, and events. This format is repeated across all Forbidden Lands games, and after you get used to the format, it gets easier and easier to actually use the information as a GM. Let's take a look at the background for this site. The most important feature to note here is the fact that it is only 4 paragraphs long. In more traditional RPG campaigns, you can end up with some really impenetrable text walls describing a location or a scene, but here we're just told that this is a town near a forest at the foot of a stony hill, on top of which is an old castle or keep. The town itself is run by 2 guilds, one of slavers and one of thieves. They comprise the town's entire government and administration. It's a cruel and dangerous hellhole of a town, and slaves are bought and sold here as a matter of course. Getting here. Each adventure site usually lists 2 or 3 ways to get the PCs to the site. Some are more restrictive than others, but you're never bound to these as a GM. They're just suggestions. For Grindbone, they suggest either that the entire party is kidnapped by slavers and start the session there as slaves on the auction block, a sort of fantasy RPG classic, or the party could be employed as mercenaries of the village bailiff to tamp down on the violence between the slave guild and the thieves guild. Legend. The legends in Forbidden Lands at first blush are just paragraphs of exposition that you read to the players, and they do serve that function, but they're also a way to insert rumors and misdirection as a matter of course. In the case of an adventure site legend, there's usually a kernel of truth about the place, but it's exaggerated here and there. Location descriptions. There are usually 10 to 12 locations in any adventure site, and the idea is that PCs will be looking at the site map to choose where to go. Each location is composed of a description that you read or paraphrase for players, and a GM-only explanation of what's going on. In the case of Grindbone, the first location is the gate. By the way, none of these sites actually come with color illustrations like this. There's a lot of GM prep that you have to do if you want to actually make things very visual for your players. I'll talk more about that in the pros and cons section of the video. Anyway, the gate is the first place the PCs might see. There are sharpened stakes pointing both inward and outward along the timber walls of the village, and several villainous guards checking everyone going in and out. Players may also meet Captain Krachulos, a sort of neutral party respected by both guilds and who keeps the peace. He's a soldier at heart and has an heirloom longsword. It doesn't specify here in the book, but I'd make that longsword have some sort of special mechanic like extra damage or something, just to bait the players a bit into trying to get it from him. The Screaming Mill is the next location, at least by number. The most notable feature here is that village slaves are strapped to the mill wheel as punishment, and they will eventually die, and whatever flour is ground in the mill ends up with a tinge of blood. The people who eat this bread call it blood bread, and that's the village's only culinary specialty. Players here will encounter Master Hargan, the town's torturer, surgeon, and executioner. I didn't even bother making a token for him, but actually he is the kind of NPC that you want to throw at players to eventually defeat, as to elicit the feeling of catharsis. Slave Square is an open area that acts as a sort of amphitheater for fighting bouts. This is a redundant location actually, since there is another more important theater or arena style location in town. At this point, I could confidently say that if a location doesn't offer anything of significance, feel free to strike it from the map. Dead-end locations like these will only slow down the session. Slave stables is where all of the village slaves are quartered, with the most valuable of them living in filthy barracks and the least valuable of them in cages or holes carved out of the ground. The most important thing to note here are 5 demon-tainted swinehounds, a sort of monstrous mix between dog and pig. They guard the area and occasionally eat a slave to keep their senses sharp. Guild Hall is the headquarters of the Thieves Guild, and where you'll find the de facto mayor of the village, Master Undar, the Duke, Alderman. If the PCs go snooping around, they'll find some treasure in a cave under this building. One problem is that you don't get anything more than a mention of this cave, and of a poison-trapped treasure chest. Clearly the intent of this game is for it to be played theater of the mind, so if you want it to be more of a mapped experience, more often than not you'll have to source a map yourself. Just remember to ditch or ignore any grids for your maps. This game uses loosely defined zones in combat and not grids. Alderhome Tavern is a violent, awful medieval fantasy tavern where slaves serve the food and beer, and there are frequent fights. Mentioned in passing here is a very interesting sub-location, the infirmary run by 3 women, the Somaya sisters, and their orc bodyguard Charna. It's later revealed that these sisters are actually orcs, which in the setting of Forbidden Lands can sometimes pass as humans. At least the females can. The tokens I made for them will obviously tip off the players a little early. These sisters are constantly screening the sick and injured for good specimens to spirit away to their orc tribe out in a nearby forest, and no one is the wiser for it. Paraxa Theater is the arena-like location that I mentioned earlier. This is where the nightly entertainment occurs. Everything from folksy theater to the occasional duel. Players will encounter the village idiot Matt Zeker here, who manages the maintenance of the theater. If the players are here during a performance, they'll also encounter Mahinaver, the town's bard who secretly worships the god of darkness and death in the setting, the Nightwalker. He's just a creepy, edgelordy kind of dude. Hop's Shed is a whole beer brewing operation that uses water from the river. Again, this location hardly warrants being a location all its own. It's more of a detail that players might observe in passing, such as you see a crude but functional brewery operation in town. Villagers here call the master brewer the Boar. Ferret Hall is another important location in terms of the optional plot events that could unfold at this site. It's the headquarters of the slaver guild known as the Bone Ferrets. Their leader, Misella Faramar, leads about 20 hardened slavers who have connections with wolfkin in the region and use the wolfkin as well as hounds to hunt down escaped slaves. His crew does not just do slaving, but everything from bodyguarding to assassinations as well. Chapel of the Rust Brothers is the local church. Okay, so in the setting, there are many different gods who are each host to different religions. One of the dominant religions, or demonic death cults to be more accurate, is the Church of Rust and Heem. In this local chapter is the resident Rust brother named Hamidus. He's a hopeless, useless drunk who doesn't represent the church's interests very well in the village, which is actually a good thing. Stonefang is the final listed location, and it's one that is kind of out of left field compared to the rest of the adventure site. It's a castle ruin that sits at the top of the hill that dominates the area, and red water flows down the hill from the structure. Additionally, one side of the hill appears to be completely frozen. The locals all think the castle is haunted, and they only use the cooler lower chambers of it to store beer. The monsters and NPCs section of each adventure site is where you're going to get half of the heart of any subplot or major plot arc advancement. The other half is found in the final events section. Events are the last part of any adventure site section and lay out the actual plots that can unfold within the context of the locations and NPCs previously described. In the case of Grindbone, there are 5 events. The first is the Slave Trader's Quandary, where the slave guild leader Misela Faramar asks the PCs to assassinate the leader of the Thieves Guild, or PCs can take the Duke's side and try to eliminate the slavers. The second event is Showdown at Alderhome, where a slave hunter named Volm is wanted for the murder of a thief. In short, the town's bailiff, Captain Crachulos, shows up at the tavern to arrest him, but the leaders of the Slavers Guild and Thieves Guild also show up to either protect the murderer or exact revenge. The PCs are hopefully caught up in the dead middle of this tavern standoff. The White Feather details a situation where a raven starts talking to the PCs and asks them to free a druid named White Sun. This druid was captured and taken to this village as a slave, and the only way the PCs can identify him is with a tattoo on his neck. Oh, by the way, the raven is actually a human. In Forbidden Lands, there are these good guy druids called Raven Sisters, and sometimes they can turn into ravens. Anyway, this is a little rescue mission. The Secret of the Sisters details those undercover orc ladies working at the town infirmary actually trying to kidnap one or more of the party members. The description of this event doesn't really connect with the rest of Grindbone's major NPCs, so you'll have to fill in the blanks here a bit. The final event involves a pack of angry orcs showing up at the gates of the village, demanding a confrontation with the orc sisters. But no one in the village knows that the orc sisters are actually orcs, so the PCs may get involved there. There's actually a final event that is sort of miscategorized as a couple of NPC descriptions. Remember that creepy castle at the top of the hill that looms over the town? Well, it turns out that it is haunted, not just by one, but 2 entities. The first is the ghost of Arbia Mundo, the last mistress of the castle who was cursed by a spurned suitor. She is confined to one part of the castle and wants the PCs to defeat or banish the Blood Mist demon who resides on the other side. This bloodling, as they're called, can be contacted or possibly defeated, and the ghost will give the PCs the location to a bunch of jewels if they manage to do so. So that's pretty much what an adventure site looks like. With Grindbone, you don't get any mention or forward movement of the overarching campaign plot, and that's typical with the first few adventure sites in any of these Forbidden Lands campaign books. The first ones are sort of like warm-up sites, meant to get the players into the game and maybe leveled up a bit before they face more high-stakes events. But just as a thought experiment, put yourself in the shoes of a GM prepping a session and try to take in everything that we covered about this adventure site. Is it too many moving parts, or is it the right amount of detail for players to chew on for a full session? Since players can go wherever and do whatever they want in a site without any sort of railroad or predetermined event triggers, the GM is expected to have all of the site's details ready for deployment, so this approach may or may not work for you. Let's discuss the pros and cons of the adventure site approach to session design. Pros include greater player freedom. We can see with the example of Grindbone, players show up to this godforsaken village, do some exploration across maybe 10 significant locations in any order that they want, talk to maybe 6 or 8 major NPCs, and eventually trigger one or more of 6 different major events, all of which transpire independently of each other. GMs might have a bit more to keep in their heads for the session, but for the players, this is a relatively large amount of freedom, which importantly isn't just based on pure improv. Replayability. So if you happen to be a GM who likes to run the same scenario for different groups, the adventure site approach is going to be really valuable for you because you'll pretty much never get the same session twice. Even with railroaded adventures, different groups of players are always surprising in how much they diverge from each other in terms of their approach to problem solving and dispute resolution. But when you give them a little miniature sandbox, such as an adventure site, the possibilities are endless. More creative problem solving. One of the major tenets in the OSR movement is to give players problems, not solutions. That's the same principle here. When players walk into an adventure site like Grindbone, every other location they go to presents them with a problem or dilemma, but there are no solutions in the book, nor should you as the GM suggest solutions. This is just one of the best things about the OSR approach. It just trusts players to play a game rather than ramrod a predetermined story down their throats. But okay, adventure sites have their own problems. Let's go through a few here. Can be a lot of extra prep. In some ways, I think adventure sites are more fun to write than to prepare for a session. The whole light footprint approach to adventure design has always been a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have this really easy to read, easy to remember set of locations and NPCs and events. It's great. You get that feeling that you can just read it and then bring it straight to the table. But on the other hand, if you want to have any sort of visualization for your players beyond the site map and a few NPC sketches, at least in the case of Forbidden Lands, then you have to source a bunch of artwork from somewhere. And once you start doing that, you realize that there's a whole list of extra NPCs that might pop up. Do you make tokens for those too? This is not a dilemma for a lot of GMs. But for me personally, I really like to have a visual experience for my players, but it can be a lot of prep. Requires more improvisation skills. Due to the fact that adventure site descriptions leave more unsaid than said, you as the GM are going to have to learn some improv skills in order to fill the blanks. In the example of Grindbone, what if for whatever reason, the players really want to hang around in that slave square and talk to whatever throwaway NPCs that you put there, and really want to unpack this location? Well, the book has 2 short paragraphs on it and no NPCs here, so you're going to have to make things up, or more likely just shuffle some details around in order to make the PC's time there meaningful. Players may feel aimless without clear goals. Some playgroups are quite accustomed to just sitting down and riding a roller coaster together, following cues that the GM throws at them. That kind of playgroup will struggle with adventure sites unless the GM leads them by the nose. It's true that even with an open-minded free play style of group, the GM still has to drop clues and signals to keep everything moving along, but you know how it is with players and clues. They don't pick up on them a lot of the time, and players not acclimated to sandbox adventure sites are going to flounder. Okay, so what are some practical tips on running an adventure site like Grindbone? Know the elements. We kind of touched on it earlier. There are some elements of Grindbone that are simply not important. You can leave those out completely, or when players get to them, just straight up tell them this is not important. But there are other elements that are important to an adventure site. Even though each site is presented in the order of locations, NPCs, and then events, you almost want to read them in backwards order, since it's the events that are most important. That's the stuff that happens after all. Any locations or NPCs that don't involve the events, you can consider secondary. But everything that does involve the events, you kind of have to commit those to your short-term memory, or at least write down some quick notes about them. Balance player freedom with narrative guidance. Easier said than done, but you should be ready as the GM to nudge the players in a direction anytime they get stuck, or even better, give them a choice of 2 directions. And it doesn't have to be subtle. If they're in Grindbone and they've just run out of things to do in the guild hall, you can just say, you can go to the tavern or the theater. Those are the 2 places in town that seem to have the most activity right now. Obviously, only do this if the players are paralyzed with choice. Otherwise, just let them go wherever they want. Don't stick to the script. Grindbone is actually kind of the perfect adventure site because it doesn't rely on any triggers that the PCs have to set off in order for the events to transpire. Things just happen no matter what the PCs do. But as you know, players can take things off the rails even when there are no rails. For example, the PCs might decide that they want to eliminate both the Thieves Guild and the Slavers Guild in town and set up a stronghold. There are rules for strongholds in Forbidden Lands, so why not? Well, the notion of PCs taking over Grindbone is not even hinted at in the book and could create all kinds of ripple effects in the region. For example, by ending the slave trade here, the nearby orc tribe who benefits from the trade could become offended. The Church of the Rust Brothers might also take offense from having their authority questioned. But by freeing hundreds of slaves, the PCs could earn allies of all stripes who come to their aid in unexpected ways at unexpected times. In other words, it could change the entire campaign in ways that aren't written in the rest of the adventure sites in the book. Let them do it. You have to let them do it. That's the real objective of these little sandboxes, to let players come up with their own cool direction for the overarching story. I wanted to dig a little deeper here and explore the notion of making an adventure site, just completely designing one from scratch. So I asked Per Holmstrom. He's also written a ton of third-party adventure sites and other supplement materials for the game. I'll leave a link down below for those. Per has also, in the course of developing materials officially and unofficially for the game, actually run the game for hundreds of sessions. Here's what he told me are the most important things to consider when making an adventure site. 1, establish the major plot. Every site should have one major thing that's going on. It doesn't have to be an epic plot. It could be as small as an encounter, but there is a general reason for the site to exist, and you want to determine that beforehand. You don't need to write down a bunch of stuff, just have the general idea down. 2, come up with a hook. You want to come up with something unusual or enticing that the players encounter right up front. For example, everyone in town is deathly afraid of meeting outsiders, and it turns out the townsfolk are all in various stages of turning into strange creatures. 3, make items interesting. Establish what the PCs will get for defeating the villain or threat, and make it more than just treasure. It can be the liberation of the townsfolk, or the cure for a disease that one of the PCs is suffering from, or a particularly useful item. And beyond just rewards, all artifacts that a party encounters in a location should carry some real weight in terms of their mechanics or significance to the location's story. For example, a coin that tells its holder what the future holds in the form of the player being allowed to ask a yes or no question, but the player needing to resist a fear attack each time they do so. And the first time one of the PCs picks up the coin, they actually see the previous horror at that location and get clues on how to defeat whatever threat they're up against. Make the monsters deadly. Obviously, you need to stat out any monsters and villains beforehand, but don't just use regular monsters out of the book, especially if it's just one monster versus the whole party for an encounter. If the PCs are fighting a single monster, that monster really needs to have some potent and interesting attacks that make the turn order and turn economy important. For example, every time the monster lands an attack, it actually grabs a PC and they lose an item from their inventory, and it leaves them prone. That kind of attack will have the party having to think really hard about what they're going to do on their turn, and it just makes things more exciting. 5, make dungeons dynamic and logical. Anytime you're drawing out a dungeon or explorable area, make sure that you create several ways to get to the major rooms or locations. Also, try to retain some semblance of logic in why things are the way they are in a dungeon. Why would there actually be a trap where there's a trap? Why would this creature be living here in this room, and how does it survive? 6, make the NPCs memorable. Just lean in all the way with every NPC. The barkeep is super tired and never haggles. The shopkeeper is comically annoyed by his idiot son. This doesn't just help players remember all the characters, it helps the GM too. And it also has the side benefit of creating new possible side quests if the players find the NPCs interesting enough. Honor the player's ideas. Be humble as a GM and don't place too much importance in one's ideas. If the players come up with something that supplants your original plans for the adventure site, go with it. Play with the players. Let them tell their story. 8, practice on 2-page spreads. Per's final advice is to try and make an adventure site fit on 2 pages. This will teach you how to leave out the unimportant parts and only include the most critical elements of a site. This is my favorite advice. Although I think 2 pages might be a little short in practical terms, I'd much prefer that over an overly written adventure scenario that has walls of descriptions and prescribed solutions to every trap, puzzle, and obstacle. The goal is not to make a 2-page adventure site here, it's to practice reducing the amount of BS in your scenario design. So there you have it, adventure sites. They're a great approach to collaborative storytelling that at least attempts to solve the problem of balancing GM guidance versus absolute player freedom. I'd love to hear your experience with this kind of adventure design, both as a player and a GM. Leave your thoughts down below. I've also posted all of the tokens and location cards in this video in my Patreon if you'd like to become a member. If you'd like the official book in which Grindbone is found, that would be Forbidden Lands Raven's Purge. I'll leave a link for that as well. And thanks to Per Holmstrom for his design advice. Links for his stuff are also down below. And thanks as always to you for watching. See ya.